Welcome to this deep dive, and this time it's all about Ramadan and pregnancy curated, just for you.
Hmm.
We've got a really interesting mix of sources here: medical websites, parenting forums, even some insights into Islamic law.
Oh, wow.
So we're going to be looking at this from all angles.
It is fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's not, a simple yes or no on fasting.
Right.
There are cultural layers, personal experiences, and even differing opinions within Islamic thought itself.
Yeah, exactly. Millions of women around the world are navigating this every year.
Right.
And it's great that you're taking the time to really understand what's involved. So, first things first, the big question: does a pregnant woman have to fast during Ramadan?
Well, the sources are pretty clear that Islam offers pregnant and breastfeeding women an exemption from fasting
Okay.
if they're concerned about their health or the babies.
Yeah.
And this flexibility is even mentioned in the Quran, which is pretty remarkable.
So it's not this rigid rule, it's built into the faith's foundation.
Right.
To consider a woman's well-being. But I'm guessing it can't be that straightforward all the time, right?
Yeah, you're right. It gets more complex.
Okay.
For example, while the Quran offers this general exemption, Islamic scholars called ulamas have different opinions on what kind of harm warrants an exemption.
Oh, interesting.
Some say any risk to the mother's health is enough, while others focus specifically on potential harm to the baby.
So even within Islamic law, there's room for interpretation. That's
Exactly.
something I bet a lot of people don't realize. But before we get too deep into the religious side of things, let's talk about the health impacts. Our sources from medical and parenting sites mention some risks, right?
Yes, but it's important to note that most of the time, fasting doesn't seem to directly harm the baby.
Okay.
The risks are more for the mother. Dehydration is a big one, especially in hot climates. And the changes in eating and sleeping patterns can lead to things like fatigue
Yeah,
or even urinary tract infections.
that makes sense. Your body's working overtime growing a human, so adding fasting on top of that has got to be tough.
Hmm.
One of our sources, Santé Magazine, highlighted a study that found babies born to mothers who fasted were on average 200 grams lighter. Did that finding jump out at you?
It did. It's a pretty noticeable difference in birth weight,
Yeah.
and it makes you wonder about the long-term implications. The study itself didn't delve into that, but it's a question worth exploring further.
Right.
You have to remember, research on this topic is ongoing.
For sure. And speaking of exploring further, it's one thing to look at studies, but we also have real stories from women who've lived this experience. One that really struck me was Fauzia's comment on the Allo Bebe website. She was dealing with gestational diabetes while pregnant during Ramadan
Oh, wow.
and talked about how hard it was to manage her blood sugar while fasting.
Yes, Fauzia's story is so important because it highlights that individual circumstances really matter.
Yeah.
Managing gestational diabetes is already challenging,
Oh, for sure.
and trying to fast on top of that can be incredibly difficult. It's a good reminder that flexibility within Islamic rulings is key.
Absolutely. No two pregnancies are the same. So what about women who do feel comfortable fasting while pregnant? What kind of advice do our sources offer to make sure they're doing it as safely as possible?
The sources are full of great tips.
Okay.
And the first one, which you might expect, is to consult with a doctor throughout your pregnancy, especially to keep an eye on things like vitamin and iron levels.
Okay.
Those are already important during pregnancy, and fasting can deplete them even more.
So working with your healthcare provider, not going it alone.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And another crucial piece of advice: hydration.
Hydration. Hydration. Can't stress that enough. But our sources get into the specifics of when to drink too, right? It's not just about guzzling gallons of water whenever you can.
You're right. The timing of your food and drinks is super important during Ramadan,
Yeah.
especially when you're pregnant. The sources talk a lot about what to eat at suhoor, the pre-dawn meal, and why.
Can you remind me and maybe our listener what sewer's all about?
Sure, suhoor is a meal you eat before the sun rises and your fast begins.
Right.
You want to focus on foods that will give you slow-release energy throughout the day. Things like whole grains, protein, and healthy fats are great choices.
Okay, so fueling up for the long haul.
Exactly.
And then there's iftar, the meal at sunset when you break your fast. I imagine that's all about replenishing and rehydrating. What do the sources recommend for iftar?
The key here is to avoid that sudden sugar rush that can happen when you break a fast. Starting with dates is a good idea because they provide a quick energy boost, but in a gentler way. Then follow that up with some easily digestible foods and, of course, plenty of fluids.
And after that, you have a more substantial dinner later in the evening, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
This is your chance to make sure you're getting all the nutrients you need, replenishing minerals you might have lost during the day, and really nourishing yourself and your baby.
So even if you are able to fast, there's a lot to think about in terms of timing and what you're eating. But we've talked a lot about the health side of things. What about the religious perspective? We touched on how Islamic law offers exemptions, but I'm curious to delve deeper into what the sources say about the nuances of fasting during pregnancy.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. As I mentioned before, there are differing opinions amongst Islamic scholars about the specific circumstances that warrant an exemption.
Right.
And this leads to some interesting nuances in how the rules are applied.
Oh, tell me more about these differing opinions. Do the sources give any examples?
They do. For example, some scholars say if a woman fears for her own health, she only has to make up the missed fasts later. But if she's worried about the baby's health, then she must both make up the fasts and provide food for a needy person for each day missed.
Wow. So there's this whole other layer of making up for missed fasts, and it depends on who you were worried about, yourself or the baby. That's a lot to consider.
Right. And on top of that, there's even debate about whether you can simply give charity instead of making up the fasts, even if you legitimately couldn't fast during your pregnancy.
It sounds like even within Islamic law, there are no easy answers.
Yeah,
Just a lot of different perspectives to consider.
exactly. And it's important for you, the listener, to understand that. It's not about finding one right answer,
Right.
but rather understanding the principles and applying them to your unique situation.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground about pregnancy, but what about breastfeeding moms? Do similar principles and exemptions apply to them as well?
They do. And there are also some unique considerations for breastfeeding mothers that we could discuss. So breastfeeding moms, they get a similar exemption from fasting during Ramadan,
Right.
pregnant women. But what about the impact on breastfeeding itself?
Mm.
Is it safe to fast while you're nursing a baby?
Yeah, that's where I was going to go next.
Well, that's where it gets a bit nuanced. Our sources generally agree that as long as a breastfeeding mom is eating well during the non-fasting hours, her breast milk quality shouldn't be negatively affected.
Okay, good. That's good to hear. I know a lot of women worry about, whether they'll still be able to produce enough milk
Right?
and if it will be nutritious enough for their baby if they're fasting.
Absolutely. It's a common concern.
Yeah.
But there are a couple of things to keep in mind. Some studies have shown that certain nutrients, like zinc, magnesium, and potassium,
Oh,
can drop slightly in the breast milk of fasting mothers. It's not usually a major cause for concern, but it's something to be aware of.
so it sounds like it's important for breastfeeding mothers to pay extra attention to their diet during Ramadan, even if they're not fasting. What kind of advice do our sources offer for making sure they're getting all the nutrients they and their babies need?
The sources highlight a few key points.
Okay.
First, keep a close eye on your baby's weight to make sure they're still gaining as expected.
Okay.
Second, and this is always important for breastfeeding moms, stay hydrated.
Always good advice.
And finally, make sure you're eating plenty of galactagogues.
Galacta what now?
Galactagogues.
That sounds important.
Yes.
Could you explain?
Of course, galactagogues are foods that help boost milk supply. Think oats, fennel leafy greens, things like that.
Oh, okay.
The Alobebe website actually have a whole section on galactagogues and what to eat to keep your milk production up.
Interesting. So lots of healthy fats, good hydration, and those special milk-boosting foods. Sounds like good advice for anyone, really, not just breastfeeding moms.
You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
Now let's circle back to the religious aspect.
Okay.
As I mentioned, breastfeeding moms have a similar exemption from fasting as pregnant women.
Okay.
If a mother fears for her health or her baby's well-being, she's not obligated to fast.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's important to acknowledge that there's often a strong emotional and social component to this decision, too.
Oh, I bet. There's already so much pressure on new moms to do everything right.
Right.
And then you add in the expectations around Ramadan.
Exactly.
It's a lot to handle.
Yes, and we see that reflected in one of our sources. Sonia on the Alabebe website commented on how guilty she felt about not fasting while breastfeeding.
Oh, wow.
It sounds like she was really struggling with that decision.
I imagine many of our listeners can relate to Sonia's experience. It's tough enough navigating motherhood without feeling judged or pressured, especially when it comes to something as personal and important as your faith.
You're right. It's so personal.
Yeah.
And it underscores the need for more open conversations about these issues. Women should feel empowered to make the choices that are best for them and their babies without fear of judgment or shame.
Well said. And it's a good reminder that Ramadan isn't just about the physical act of fasting. There's so much more to it.
Exactly. There are so many ways to connect with your faith and observe Ramadan.
Right.
Our sources emphasize that even if you can't physically fast, you can still participate fully by focusing on prayer, reading the Quran, giving to charity, spending time with loved ones, and reflecting on your relationship with God.
It sounds like it's about connecting with your faith on a deeper level, regardless of your physical circumstances.
You've got it. And in a way that's even more meaningful than simply going through the motions of fasting without truly engaging with the spiritual side of the month.
So whether you're pregnant, breastfeeding, or facing any other health challenge, there's no need to feel like you're missing out on Ramadan.
Absolutely. In fact, those challenges can sometimes lead to even deeper and more profound spiritual experiences.
This deep dive has been fascinating so far. We've explored the medical and religious considerations, heard personal stories, and uncovered some unexpected complexities. What are some key takeaways you hope our listeners will walk away with?
For me, the biggest takeaway is that there is no single right answer.
No.
When it comes to Ramadan and pregnancy or breastfeeding, Islamic law offers flexibility. Medical advice is crucial, and each woman's personal circumstances are unique.
It sounds like it's all about gathering information, weighing your options, and then making an informed and empowered choice for yourself.
And remember, there are so many ways to observe Ramadan beyond just fasting. Don't feel pressure to conform to anyone else's expectations. Focus on what feels right for you.
Before we wrap up, I want to pose a question to you, our listener. Imagine a friend is coming to you for advice about Ramadan and pregnancy. Based on what we've learned today, what is the single most important piece of advice you would give her?
That's a great question to consider. If I were talking to a friend, I'd probably tell her to listen to her body, consult with her doctor and a trusted religious advisor, and above all, to prioritize her health and well-being.
That's excellent advice. It's about finding that balance between honoring your faith, caring for your body, and nurturing your little one.
Yeah.
Speaking of balance, our sources brought up a really interesting point about the potential risks of not fasting during pregnancy, particularly for women who are at risk for gestational diabetes.
You're right, that was a fascinating point.
Yep.
We often focus on the potential risks of fasting, but there's also the flip side to consider. Some studies suggest that for women who are already prone to gestational diabetes, not fasting during Ramadan might actually increase their risk of developing the condition.
So it's almost like a double-edged sword.
In a way, yes.
Right.
It just goes to show how many individual factors are involved.
Yeah.
And it reinforces how important it is to work closely with your healthcare provider to determine what's best for you and your specific situation.
It's all about personalized care, not blanket statements.
Exactly.
And this whole discussion really highlights the need for culturally sensitive healthcare. It's so important to have doctors who understand the nuances of Ramadan and can provide guidance that's both medically sound and respectful of religious beliefs.
I couldn't agree more. It's about bridging that gap between faith and medicine to ensure the best possible outcome for both mother and baby.
It feels like we've successfully navigated some pretty complex territory here. We've talked about Islamic rulings, explored the health considerations from different angles, and even heard from women who have lived through these experiences firsthand.
And we've uncovered some surprising insights along the way. Things like the potential impact of fasting on birth weight.
Right.
And the need to consider both sides of the coin, the risks of fasting and the risks of not fasting, depending on the situation.
This deep dive has been incredibly insightful, and I hope our listeners feel more informed and empowered to make their own decisions about Ramadan and pregnancy or breastfeeding, whatever those decisions may be.
And remember, even if you can't fast, there are still so many beautiful ways to embrace the spirit of Ramadan through prayer, charity, reflection, and connection with your community.
Beautifully said. Thank you for joining us on this journey of discovery. Until next time, keep those minds curious and those hearts open. This whole conversation has been really eye-opening, It really highlights how important it is to talk about these topics openly and honestly.
I agree.
Yeah.
It creates a space for women to share without judgment.
Exactly. And to ask questions and express their concerns without feeling pressure, Those support systems are so important.
Absolutely. They can make all the difference.
Yeah, within families, among friends, and even online in those forums we were looking at. The power of shared experience,
Right.
Feeling like you're not alone.
It can be so empowering.
Okay, so before we wrap up this deep dive, is there anything else from the sources that really stands out to you? Any final takeaways for our listeners?
One thing that really struck me was the emphasis on intention during Ramadan.
Intention. Can you say a bit more about that?
Sure. So in Islam, the intention behind your actions is just as important as the actions themselves.
Okay.
So even if you're not physically able to fast,
Right.
if you have that sincere intention to observe Ramadan and connect with the spiritual side of it,
Right.
that can be so meaningful.
It's not just about the physical act, it's about the inner journey too.
Exactly. And that
Yeah.
journey is different for everyone.
I love that. Okay. So if you had to sum up this whole deep dive in just one sentence, what would it be?
Hmm. That's a good one. I'd say that when it comes to Ramadan and pregnancy or breastfeeding, there's no one-size-fits-all approach. It's about seeking knowledge, listening to your body, consulting with trusted advisors, and making a choice that feels right for you and your faith.
Beautifully put. I hope this deep dive has given you, our listener, a clear understanding of this really important topic. Knowledge is power, and now you're equipped with the information to make those informed decisions.
And if you still have questions, that's great. It means you're curious, and there are always more resources to explore. Just keep learning. Keep asking those questions.
Keep growing.
Yes, exactly.
Well, until next time, keep diving deep.